Corrections Officer Terrell Hammond had been with the Riverside County Detention Center for 11 years. When he walked into a situation that would destroy his career, cost the county $3,400,000, and send him to federal prison for 12 years. He was 38 years old, experienced enough to understand the consequences of assaulting an inmate, but apparently convinced that his authority inside those walls made him untouchable. One Tuesday morning at 6:38 a.m. in the intake processing area of a medium-security detention facility, Hammond received a new arrival transferred from the federal courthouse. The new arrival was Marcus Dalton, a 14-year veteran federal inspector, conducting an undercover compliance audit. What Hammond did next, ignoring Dalton's identification, physically assaulting him without provocation, and continuing the assault even after Dalton's credentials were verified, would become a landmark case proving that corrections officers who abuse their authority face the same criminal justice system they claim to uphold. Hammond's brutality was captured on 3 separate security cameras. The footage showed everything: the unprovoked assault, Dalton's repeated attempts to de-escalate, Hammond's continued violence even after a supervisor arrived. That footage would be played in federal court, watched by millions online, and used in DOJ training programs nationwide as an example of how unchecked power destroys both victims and perpetrators. A black man in his late 30s, Marcus Dalton, stood in the intake processing room wearing standard-issue Orange County jail scrubs that he'd been given 15 minutes earlier as part of his undercover role. His actual federal credentials were sealed in an envelope with the Warden. Standard protocol for unannounced inspections. No weapon, no backup, no visible authority, just an inspector doing exactly what Congress mandated his office to do. But Officer Hammond saw him through a lens so warped by power and prejudice that he couldn't imagine this new inmate might be someone who could end his career. Before we continue, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these need to be shared, and your support helps us expose the abuse that happens behind bars, where cameras are supposed to protect people, but often don't. The Riverside County Detention Center sits on a 47-acre compound off Highway 91 in Riverside, California. It's a sprawling complex of concrete and razor wire, housing approximately 1,200 inmates in medium and maximum security wings. The facility was built in 1987 and expanded twice, in 1995 and 2008. Gray walls, fluorescent lighting, the constant echo of metal doors, and the smell of industrial cleaner mixed with anxiety. The intake processing area is where new arrivals enter the system. It's a sterile room with concrete floors, metal benches bolted to the walls, and a processing desk behind bulletproof glass. Security cameras cover every angle. One above the entrance, one over the processing desk, one in each corner. The cameras record continuously, 24 hours a day, storing footage for 90 days before deletion unless flagged for review. It was 6:38 a.m. on a Tuesday in September. The early morning shift had just started. The overnight crew was finishing paperwork. The day crew was filtering in, checking assignments, reviewing incident reports from the previous 12 hours. The intake area was quiet. Only 3 new arrivals were scheduled that morning, 2 from local arrests and 1 transfer from federal court. The fluorescent lights hummed. The air conditioning cycled on with a mechanical wheeze. Outside the barred windows, the California sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the empty yard. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, in the way correctional facilities always are in the early morning hours. Tired officers, anxious inmates, the routine violence of incarceration about to begin another day. Officer Terrell Hammond arrived for his shift at 6:20 a.m. He'd worked the intake processing unit for the past 6 months, a rotation he'd requested specifically because it gave him first contact with new arrivals. He liked that. He liked establishing dominance early. He liked making sure new inmates understood exactly how things worked inside Riverside County Detention. That morning, Hammond was in a particularly foul mood. He'd gotten into an argument with his girlfriend the night before. He'd slept poorly. He was running on 4 hours of sleep and too much caffeine. And he was about to meet Marcus Dalton, though he didn't know the name yet, didn't know the credentials, didn't know he was about to make the worst decision of his life. Marcus Dalton had been a federal inspector with the Bureau of Prisons Office of Internal Affairs for 14 years. 14 years investigating complaints of staff misconduct, civil rights violations, and systemic failures inside federal and state correctional facilities. He'd conducted over 200 inspections, interviewed thousands of inmates and staff members, and written reports that led to 47 staff terminations, 12 criminal prosecutions, and policy changes affecting detention centers across 6 western states. His colleagues called him thorough. His supervisors called him fearless. Defense attorneys whose clients he'd investigated called him relentless. He'd gone undercover 23 times in his career, posing as an inmate to observe conditions that couldn't be assessed through announced inspections. He'd documented beatings, medical neglect, sexual assault by staff, illegal punishment tactics, and the kind of everyday brutality that thrives in places where power is absolute and oversight is minimal. Dalton had testified before Congress twice about conditions in federal detention. He'd been interviewed by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and 60 Minutes. He'd received death threats from corrections officers' unions and commendations from civil rights organizations. At 39 years old, Marcus Dalton was exactly where he'd fought to be, in a position to hold accountable people who believed their badges made them untouchable. Dalton had graduated from Howard University with a degree in criminal justice, then spent 2 years as a paralegal at the ACLU's National Prison Project, learning the constitutional framework that governed incarceration. He'd attended the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia, completing the Criminal Investigator Training Program with honors. He'd earned certifications in interrogation techniques, forensic analysis, and civil rights law. He'd clerked for Judge Patricia Williams in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, researching Eighth Amendment cases involving cruel and unusual punishment. He'd published 3 articles in law journals about accountability mechanisms in correctional systems. The Department of Justice had awarded him the Attorney General's Award for Distinguished Service in 2019 for an investigation that led to federal prosecution of 7 corrections officers in Arizona who'd been running an extortion scheme targeting inmates' families. At 39 years old, Marcus Dalton was married to Dr. Simone Dalton, a pediatric surgeon at UCLA Medical Center. They had 2 daughters, ages 7 and 9. Dalton had grown up in South Central Los Angeles, the son of a public school teacher and a postal worker. He'd seen firsthand how the criminal justice system treated black men. He'd lost 2 cousins to prison violence. He'd watched his uncle spend 18 years in San Quentin for a crime he didn't commit until DNA evidence exonerated him. Those experiences shaped everything Dalton did professionally. He wasn't just an inspector. He was someone who understood what it meant to be powerless inside a system designed to crush you. And he was determined to make that system accountable. That Tuesday morning, Dalton was conducting an unannounced compliance inspection of Riverside County Detention Center. The facility had received 17 formal complaints in the past 18 months. Allegations of excessive force, inadequate medical care, racial harassment, and deliberate indifference to inmate safety. 2 separate inmates had filed federal lawsuits alleging constitutional violations. A federal judge had ordered the Bureau of Prisons to investigate. Dalton's assignment was straightforward: enter the facility undercover, observe conditions for 72 hours, document any violations, and file a comprehensive report. He'd coordinated with the warden, Robert Chen, a 28-year corrections veteran who'd personally sealed Dalton's federal credentials in an envelope and locked them in his office safe. Only 3 people in the entire facility knew Dalton's real identity: the warden, the deputy warden, and the head of internal affairs. Dalton had arrived at Riverside County Courthouse at 5:30 a.m., where he'd been processed as a federal detainee awaiting transfer. The paperwork listed him as Marcus Dalton, awaiting sentencing on a white-collar fraud charge. His cover story was simple: federal defendant, first-time offender, cooperative, low security risk. He'd been transported to the detention center in standard transport chains, hands and feet shackled, exactly like any other federal detainee. He wore the orange scrubs they'd given him in processing. He had no weapon, no phone, no visible credentials. His wedding ring was in an evidence bag. His watch was in property storage. He looked like what he was pretending to be: a scared first-timer entering the system. He'd done this 22 times before. He knew the routine. He knew how to observe without drawing attention. He knew when to speak up and when to stay silent. But he'd never encountered someone like Terrell Hammond. But to Officer Terrell Hammond, Marcus Dalton was just another inmate, another black man in county scrubs, another body to process, another threat to dominance, another opportunity to establish control through fear and violence. Hammond saw an inmate who looked too calm, too composed, too comfortable. And in Hammond's mind, that calm needed to be broken. That composure needed to be shattered. That comfort needed to be replaced with fear. And Hammond was about to make that happen. Terrell Hammond was 38 years old. He'd been a corrections officer at Riverside County Detention Center for 11 years, working his way up from overnight watch to day shift intake processing. He was big, 6'3", and 240 pounds, with a shaved head and arms covered in tattoos. His supervisors described him as results-oriented but sometimes lacking in professional boundaries, and overly aggressive in situations that required de-escalation. Hammond had joined corrections work after 2 failed attempts to become a police officer. He'd washed out of the academy twice, once for excessive aggression during training scenarios, and once for failing the psychological evaluation. Corrections work had lower standards. He'd been hired by Riverside County within 3 months of his second police academy failure. And for 11 years, he'd been exactly the kind of officer who made incarceration more dangerous for everyone inside. In 11 years, Terrell Hammond had compiled a record that should have resulted in termination long before Marcus Dalton ever walked through those doors. 19 formal complaints. 14 of them involved allegations of excessive force, verbal harassment, or racially motivated abuse against inmates of color. 4 had been sustained, resulting in written reprimands, suspensions, and mandatory retraining. The other 15 had been closed with insufficient evidence or conflicting witness statements. The standard outcome when the only witnesses are inmates whose credibility is systematically dismissed. Hammond had a pattern. He targeted inmates during their first hours in custody, when they were most vulnerable, most disoriented, most likely to submit without resistance. A 22-year-old, black man arrested for marijuana possession. Hammond slammed him face first into a wall during intake processing, fracturing his nose and 2 teeth. The incident report claimed the inmate had lunged at Hammond. Security footage showed no such movement. The complaint was sustained. Hammond received a 3-day suspension. A 35-year-old Latino man awaiting trial on drug charges. Hammond pepper-sprayed him in his cell after the man asked to speak to a supervisor about missing medication. The incident report claimed the inmate was threatening violence. 3 other inmates testified Hammond sprayed him without provocation. The complaint was sustained. Hammond received a written reprimand and anger management training. A 19-year-old Asian American college student arrested during a protest. Hammond strip-searched him in full view of other inmates, a clear violation of policy. The student filed a federal lawsuit. The county settled for $175,000. Hammond received mandatory retraining in constitutional rights and appropriate use of force. The pattern was undeniable. The documentation was extensive, but Hammond remained employed. His union protected him. His supervisors noted problems, but rarely followed through with meaningful discipline. The culture inside Riverside County Detention treated inmate complaints as background noise, expected friction, the cost of maintaining order. And so Hammond kept working, kept targeting vulnerable inmates, kept escalating situations that required calm, kept proving that some people should never be given power over others. That Tuesday morning at 6:38 a.m., Hammond was standing at the intake processing desk when he received word that a new federal detainee was arriving. The transport officer handed him the paperwork. Marcus Dalton, 39 years old, federal fraud charge, awaiting sentencing, low security risk. Hammond glanced at the photo. Black male, first-timer, fraud charge. Probably some white-collar criminal thinking he was better than the general population. Probably thinking his education or his background would get him special treatment. Hammond decided immediately that this inmate needed an attitude adjustment. Needed to understand that inside these walls, none of that mattered. Needed to learn that Terrell Hammond decided who got respect and who got broken. He walked toward the holding cell where Dalton was waiting, his mind already filling in the narrative he wanted. Inmate shows disrespect. Hammond establishes dominance, problem solved. Hammond entered the holding area at 6:41 a.m. His body language broadcast aggression. Shoulders squared, jaw tight, eyes scanning for weakness. He saw Marcus Dalton standing calmly near the bench, hands at his sides, posture neutral. That calm bothered Hammond. First-timers were supposed to be scared. They were supposed to show fear. This guy looked too comfortable, too composed, like he'd been through this before, like he wasn't intimidated. In Hammond's mind, that was a problem, a challenge to authority, a sign of disrespect that needed immediate correction. He walked directly toward Dalton, his right hand moving to his baton. Do you think corrections officers with multiple excessive force complaints should be removed from inmate contact positions? Drop your answer below. Marcus Dalton was standing near the metal bench, mentally cataloging the intake area for his report, camera positions, lighting conditions, accessibility for inmates with disabilities. When he became aware of someone approaching with unmistakable aggressive intent, he looked up and saw Corrections Officer Terrell Hammond, nameplate visible on his uniform, moving toward him with shoulders squared and expression hard. Get against the wall. Dalton's training kicked in immediately. He recognized the tone, the posture, the setup for escalation. But his assignment required him to maintain his cover for as long as possible. I haven't done anything. I said get against the wall. Now, Dalton remained calm, hands visible, body language non-threatening. He was documenting everything: time, officer's name, exact words, witness positions. I just got here. I'm following procedure. Hammond stepped closer, invading Dalton's personal space, close enough that Dalton could smell the coffee on his breath. You think you get to talk back to me? I'm not talking back. I'm telling you there's no reason for this. Hammond's jaw tightened. His hand moved to his baton, fingers wrapping around the grip. You're fresh meat. That means you learn real quick who runs this place. Dalton made a decision. He needed to attempt de-escalation before this got worse. His cover was less important than preventing violence. There's been a mistake. I need to speak to the warden. The warden doesn't care about you. Nobody cares about you. Dalton's voice remained steady, but he shifted his stance slightly, positioning himself to protect his head if Hammond struck. I'm Inspector Marcus Dalton, Federal Bureau of Prisons. I'm conducting an unannounced compliance inspection. Hammond's expression didn't change. If anything, it hardened. His fingers tightened on the baton. Yeah, and I'm the president. Face the wall before I make you. Officer Hammond, my credentials are sealed with Warden Chen. You can verify this with one phone call. Hammond pulled his baton free from his belt, the metal stick gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Face the wall. Dalton raised his hands slowly, palms forward, demonstrating compliance. I'm not resisting. I'm asking you to verify my identity before this goes any further. The surveillance camera in the northeast corner had a clear view of everything. Dalton's calm posture, his raised hands, his verbal attempts to de-escalate. Hammond's aggressive stance, the baton in his hand, the decision forming behind his eyes. This is where experience becomes liability. This is where assumptions become assault. Officer Hammond had processed hundreds of inmates. He'd heard every excuse, every lie, every desperate claim. In his mind, inmates lied constantly. They claimed innocence. They claimed connections. They claimed credentials they didn't have. Hammond's experience told him this was just another inmate trying to talk his way out of the routine humiliation of intake processing. That experience, that pattern recognition, was about to destroy his life. The intake area had gone quiet. Two other corrections officers, David Park and Amanda Reeves, had been processing paperwork at the desk. Both looked up as Hammond's voice rose. Both saw the baton in his hand. Park called out, "Hammond, what's going on?" Hammond ignored him. He stepped forward and swung the baton, a controlled strike aimed at Dalton's shoulder to force him against the wall. Dalton saw it coming. His training screamed at him to defend himself. He could have blocked the strike, could have disarmed Hammond, could have ended this in 3 seconds. But he was undercover. He was documenting. and physical resistance would compromise everything. He turned slightly, protecting his head, and the baton connected with his left shoulder. The impact was substantial, designed to hurt, designed to intimidate. "Officer Hammond, I am complying. There is no need for force." Hammond hit him again, this time in the lower back, hard enough to drive Dalton forward against the concrete wall. The other officers moved. Park stood up, his voice sharp. "Hammond, stand down. What the hell are you doing?" Reeves reached for her radio. "Supervisor to intake. Situation escalating." Hammond grabbed Dalton's left arm and wrenched it behind his back, applying the kind of pain compliance hold that crosses the line into deliberate torture. Dalton's voice remained controlled, but the pain was evident. "I'm not resisting. Everyone here is witnessing this." Hammond slammed Dalton's face against the wall. The impact split Dalton's lip. Blood ran down his chin onto the orange scrubs. Park moved around the desk, shouting now, "Hammond, let him go. That's enough." Hammond ignored him. He pulled Dalton's other arm back, twisting both wrists upward at an angle that sent white-hot pain through Dalton's shoulders. "You don't tell me what to do. You don't talk back. You don't exist until I say you exist." Dalton knew he had reached a decision point. He could reveal his identity forcefully, could demand Hammond stop, could use his training to protect himself. But the moment he did that, the inspection was compromised. The documentation became questionable. The value of his undercover observation dropped to 0. He chose documentation over self-defense. "My name is Marcus Dalton. I am a federal inspector. This assault is being recorded. Officer Hammond, you are making a career-ending mistake." Hammond drove his knee into Dalton's lower back, forcing him harder against the wall. "Shut up." Reeves was on the radio. "Supervisor needed in intake immediately. Officer using force on a detainee claiming federal credentials." Park grabbed Hammond's shoulder. "Terrell, stop. He's saying he's federal. You need to verify before you do anything else." Hammond shoved Park away. "He's lying. They all lie." He pulled plastic flex cuffs from his belt and zip-tied Dalton's wrists behind his back, pulling them tight enough to cut off circulation. Dalton's voice was measured, each word deliberate, each syllable captured by the cameras. "Officer Hammond is assaulting me without provocation. I have identified myself as a federal inspector. I am not resisting. This is excessive force. This is a federal crime." Hammond stepped back, breathing hard, baton still in his hand. And that's when Warden Robert Chen walked through the door. Should officers who ignore claims of federal credentials face automatic criminal prosecution? Let me know what you think. Warden Robert Chen arrived at 6:47 a.m., 9 minutes after the assault began. He was a 28-year veteran of corrections work, a former Marine who'd run facilities in 3 states and testified before Congress about violence in detention. He'd seen plenty of officer mistakes in his career. He disciplined staff for excessive force, terminated employees for civil rights violations, and personally testified in criminal trials against corrections officers who'd crossed the line from authority into criminality. He walked into the intake area and immediately assessed the situation. Marcus Dalton, the federal inspector whose credentials Chen himself had locked in his office safe, standing against the wall with blood running from his split lip, hands flex-cuffed behind his back. Officer Terrell Hammond, baton in hand, breathing hard. 2 other officers, Park and Reeves, standing nearby with expressions that said they knew something terrible had just happened. Chen's voice was cold and final. "What happened here?" Hammond turned, his expression defensive. "Inmate was disrespectful, refused to comply with orders. I had to use necessary force to establish control." Chen walked closer, his eyes on Dalton. "What's your name?" "Marcus Dalton. Federal Bureau of Prisons, Office of Internal Affairs. Inspector conducting an unannounced compliance review." Chen's expression didn't change, but everyone in the room saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. He pulled out his phone and called his office. "Bring me the envelope from my safe. The sealed envelope I locked up this morning. Now." He hung up and turned to Hammond. "You just assaulted a federal inspector. A federal inspector I personally cleared for undercover work in this facility." Hammond's face went pale. He didn't identify himself properly. Dalton spoke, his voice carrying despite the pain. "I identified myself 3 times. I asked you to verify with the warden. I told you my credentials were sealed. It's all on camera." Chen's assistant arrived within 2 minutes, carrying the envelope. Chen broke the seal and removed Dalton's federal credentials: the badge, the identification card, the official letter from the Department of Justice authorizing the inspection. He held them up for Hammond to see. "These are the credentials of the man you just assaulted." Hammond's hands were shaking. "I didn't know. He looked like..." "Like what, Officer Hammond? Like an inmate? That's what he was supposed to look like. That's what undercover means." Chen's voice dropped to something dangerous. "Badge, baton, keys. You're on administrative leave. Effective immediately pending criminal investigation." Hammond's protest was weak. "Warden, I was following protocol." "You assaulted a federal inspector. You ignored his identification. You continued beating him after other officers told you to stop. Give me your badge." Hammond fumbled with his uniform, removing his badge, baton, and keys. His hands shook as he handed them over. For the first time, he seemed to understand what he'd done. Chen approached Dalton carefully. "Inspector Dalton, on behalf of Riverside County Detention Center, I apologize. This should never have happened." Dalton's response was measured. "Warden, I'll need the complete surveillance footage, Officer Hammond's personnel file, and access to his complaint history. I'll also need medical documentation of these injuries and a formal incident report." He paused, his eyes on Hammond. "And I'll be recommending criminal prosecution. Should corrections officers face federal criminal charges for assaulting federal inspectors? Drop your answer." Within 6 hours, the surveillance footage had leaked. Someone inside the detention center, never identified publicly, sent the videos to the Los Angeles Times, the ACLU, and 3 different civil rights organizations. The footage was devastating. Clear angles showing Hammond's unprovoked assault, Dalton's repeated identification as a federal inspector, Hammond continuing the beating even after other officers intervened. Federal inspector beaten in undercover prison inspection, DOJ employee, assaulted by officer with 19 prior complaints. Video shows corrections, officer ignoring federal credentials before assault. The outrage was immediate and universal. The FBI issued a statement condemning the attack on a federal employee. The Department of Justice announced a comprehensive investigation. Civil rights groups demanded accountability. The video went viral across every platform, viewed 14 million times in the first 48 hours. Terrell Hammond's life imploded within 24 hours. He was placed on administrative leave without pay while investigations proceeded. The FBI opened a criminal investigation for assault on a federal officer. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division launched a pattern and practice review of the entire detention center. Hammond hired an attorney who advised him to remain silent. He deleted his social media accounts as the death threats poured in. His home address was posted online. Protesters gathered outside his house. His girlfriend left him. His family received threatening calls. The Corrections Officers Union initially defended him, issuing a statement about the challenges of maintaining order in detention facilities. But after reviewing the surveillance footage and Dalton's complaint history, the union quietly withdrew its support. No one wanted to defend what the cameras had captured. Marcus Dalton filed a federal lawsuit 14 days after the assault. The lawsuit named Terrell Hammond personally, Warden Robert Chen for supervisory failure, and Riverside County for maintaining a culture that allowed officers with extensive complaint histories to remain in positions of power. The claims were comprehensive: assault and battery on a federal officer, 18 U.S.C. Paragraph 111, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, 42 U.S.C. Paragraph 1983, excessive force in violation of the Eighth Amendment, failure to intervene by supervisors aware of Hammond's complaint history, intentional infliction of emotional distress, failure to train and supervise officers with documented patterns of violence. The complaint included Hammond's complete personnel file, 19 formal complaints over 11 years, 4 sustained findings of excessive force, 3 suspensions, mandatory retraining that never changed behavior, and a pattern so clear that supervisors' failure to remove him constituted deliberate indifference. The complaint also included medical documentation: fractured rib, severe contusions, traumatic injury to both shoulders, split lip requiring stitches, and psychological trauma from a deliberate assault by someone entrusted with power. Riverside County's attorneys reviewed the evidence and reached the obvious conclusion: indefensible. The surveillance footage showed everything. The complaint history proved the county knew Hammond was dangerous. The federal inspector's credentials eliminated any possible claim of reasonable mistake. The county settled 11 months later, paying $340,000 to Marcus Dalton. The settlement included mandatory reforms: automatic removal of any corrections officer after 5 sustained complaints, independent civilian oversight of excessive force allegations, quarterly DOJ compliance audits, and a requirement that all assault claims by inmates be investigated by an outside agency rather than internal affairs. But the settlement was secondary to the criminal prosecution that followed. Terrell Hammond was arrested 3 months after the assault. The federal charges were severe: assault on a federal officer, maximum 20 years, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, maximum 10 years, and obstruction of a federal proceeding, maximum 20 years. Hammond's attorney negotiated a plea agreement to avoid trial. Hammond pleaded guilty to assault on a federal officer and civil rights violation. In exchange, the obstruction charge was dropped. At sentencing, federal judge Patricia Morrison was unsparing. "Officer Hammond, you assaulted a federal inspector conducting lawful oversight. You ignored his credentials. You continued beating him after being told to stop. You represent everything that is wrong with corrections work in America. This court sentences you to 12 years in federal prison." Hammond was led from the courtroom in handcuffs. His 11-year career had ended with him becoming an inmate himself. Marcus Dalton testified at Hammond's sentencing hearing. His testimony was powerful, controlled, and devastating. "I've been a federal inspector for 14 years. I've conducted over 200 inspections of correctional facilities. I've gone undercover 23 times to observe conditions that can't be assessed through announced visits. I understand the challenges corrections officers face. I understand the pressure, the danger, the difficulty of maintaining order in facilities designed to warehouse human beings." He paused. "But I also understand the difference between necessary force and deliberate brutality. And what Officer Hammond did to me that morning was not necessary force. It was a deliberate assault designed to inflict pain and establish dominance over someone he believed was powerless to fight back." Another pause. "I identified myself as a federal inspector 3 times. I told Officer Hammond my credentials were sealed with the warden. I asked him to verify my identity with a single phone call. I complied with every order. I raised my hands. I positioned myself against the wall. I did everything required to de-escalate that situation." His voice strengthened. "And Officer Hammond beat me anyway. He struck me with a baton. He slammed my face into a concrete wall. He twisted my arms until I thought my shoulders would dislocate. He did this while 2 other officers told him to stop. He did this while I told him he was being recorded. He did this because he wanted to hurt someone he believed couldn't hurt him back." He looked directly at Hammond. Officer Hammond had 19 complaints over 11 years. 19. 14 of them involved allegations of excessive force against inmates of color. 4 were sustained. 4 times, his supervisors found that he had used excessive force. And yet he remained on duty, processing new arrivals, given first contact with the most vulnerable people in the system. His voice dropped, but carried weight. "The county will pay $3,400 because of what Officer Hammond did. That's significant. That's accountability. But money doesn't undo the trauma of being assaulted by someone entrusted with power. It doesn't erase the message that even federal credentials, even clear identification, even compliance isn't enough to protect you from violence when bias and brutality meet unchecked authority." He looked at the judge. "If this can happen to me, a federal inspector with resources and authority, what happens to the inmates without credentials, without connections, without anyone outside those walls who believes them? What happens to the people whose assaults aren't captured on camera, whose complaints are filed away, whose voices are dismissed because they're just inmates? And who cares what happens to inmates?" The courtroom was silent. Should excessive force complaints trigger independent outside investigations, rather than internal affairs review. Drop your answer. This wasn't just about one corrections officer or one assault. This was about a system that let Terrell Hammond accumulate 19 complaints over 11 years and remain in a position where he had daily contact with vulnerable people. This was about a culture that treats inmate complaints as background noise rather than documentation of patterns. This was about the violence that happens every day behind bars, when the people entrusted with power believe they're untouchable. Hammond's complaint history told a story his supervisors ignored for more than a decade. 19 complaints, 14 involving excessive force against people of color, 4 sustained findings, and yet Hammond was never removed from inmate contact positions. He was retrained, counseled, suspended, reprimanded, but always returned to the same role that gave him power over defenseless people. The pattern was undeniable. Young black men during intake, Latino inmates asking for medical care, Asian American detainees exercising their rights. The targets varied, but the behavior never changed. Hammond used violence to establish dominance. He targeted people he believed couldn't fight back. He exploited the power imbalance that makes corrections work uniquely dangerous when staffed by people like him, and the system protected him until he assaulted someone who had the resources and authority to destroy his career. Terrell Hammond is serving 12 years in federal prison. That's justice. He's experiencing firsthand the system he abused for over a decade. Riverside County paid $3,400,000. That's accountability. The money funds reforms that might prevent the next Hammond from accumulating 19 complaints. The detention center implemented mandatory oversight. That's consequences. But incarceration and settlements don't undo the trauma Hammond inflicted on dozens of inmates over 11 years. They don't restore dignity to the people he beat. They don't erase the message that power without accountability destroys everyone it touches. The real question is, what changes now? Do correctional facilities finally remove officers after 5 complaints instead of 19? Do supervisors finally connect the dots at complaint 3? Do we finally acknowledge that sustained findings of excessive force should mean permanent removal from inmate contact, not retraining that never works? Do we finally recognize that internal affairs investigations of excessive force are inherently compromised when the investigators work alongside the officers they're investigating? Do we finally understand that giving someone power over another human being requires more than a uniform and a paycheck? Because if we don't fix the systems that kept Hammond employed for 11 years, despite 19 complaints, if we don't address the culture that treats inmate lives as disposable, then we're just waiting for the next Hammond, the next victim, the next viral video, the next federal prosecution. Comment if you believe this should be federal law. Corrections officers with 3 or more sustained excessive force complaints are permanently banned from working in any detention facility, with findings entered into a national database accessible to all hiring authorities. And if you think these stories need to be told, if you believe accountability starts with exposure and change starts with pressure, then hit that subscribe button. We're not stopping. We're going to keep exposing the officers who abuse their power. We're going to keep demanding systems that protect the powerless. We're going to keep fighting for the inmates, the inspectors, the ordinary people who deserve safety even behind bars. This isn't just about one corrections officer or one federal inspector. It's about all of us and the systems we're willing to tolerate when they operate behind walls we never see.